Welcome, I'm Jess Lujan. Welcome to KUAM's Decision 2014. I want to introduce my producer this morning, Keen, JC Conception. In studio with me this morning, we have incumbent Senator Tom Ada, Democrat, and Republican senatorial candidate Romeo Carlos. Good evening, gentlemen, or good morning, gentlemen. Good evening. I'm still a night owl here.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you
Yes,
guys doing this morning?
Oh, fine, thank you.
Great, fantastic. Senator, I'm going to start with you again. Tell the people of Guam, not like it, nobody knows you, but tell them again who you are, where you are on the side of the ballot, and of course your platform for this upcoming 2014 election.
Great, thank you. I'm Tom Ada, and I'm currently serving out my seventh term, and so I'm coming back and asking, of course, for re-election to my eighth term. I think what's important to note about the fact that I've served 7 terms is that there are really 7 non-consecutive terms. I served for 3 consecutive terms when I first started back in the 90s. And then at that time, I thought I was ready to run for the gubernatorial race, and it was the Tom and Lou race at that time. It was premature for me. That gave me a chance, though, to sit out for 2 years and really think things over and do the things I've wanted to do but never had the time. I came back in again 2 years later, and I was successful. I came back into the legislature, and then Robert Underwood asked me to run with him. I did. Again, we lost. And then this time, I stayed out for 6 years, and that 6-year reprieve was really good because it gave me a chance to mature more, really take a different perspective, standing from outside of the arena. And then when the military buildup came up, I said, this is the time that I've got to get back in and participate so I can make my contribution. Coming back in then, after that 6-year reprieve, certainly was very good, I think. And I think that I've accomplished a lot in this last 6 years, and I think there's still a lot more to be accomplished. My platform basically focuses on really 3 major topics. That is public safety, making sure, the second item is making sure that those who are in need of assistance get the necessary assistance, and finally the issue of equal opportunity for everyone on this island. And I think during the show, hopefully, we'll be able to elaborate more on that.
Okay, great. Romeo, you got a minute 30?
Okay. Good morning. Thanks for having me here today, Jesse. My name is Romeo Carlos. I'm number 8 on the Republican side of the ballot in this primary election. And when I first started, I came into this race with the idea of very specific things that I'd like to do, which really reflect things I've heard from the people through Guam blog, which I write and produce. However, so far, I've been more shocked about the apathy and the distrust that tens of thousands of people have in government because of the lack of truth and leadership, because of the lack of work that really focuses on what they need. So my first and my hopefully only term, I'd like to only run 1 term, no more than 2, but what I'd like to do is focus every day, every hour of the day, in doing the kind of work that will rebuild trust in leadership so that we can have a government that encourages our young people, our young adults, to get involved, to step up to the plate and do what they need to do. Chief among my issues, my platforms that I've heard people talk about are the marijuana issue, for example. We're looking at soaring crime rates, violent crime driven for a lot of reasons by a dependency on drugs, ice. I think we should fight crime, not cannabis, and that's one of the main things I like to focus on.
Okay, thank you, Romeo. Let me start with you, Romeo, and I'll ask Senator this as well. I mean, one of the things you talked about is the constituency out there that are writing in your blog or talking to you in regards to the distrust in government. Should you be allowed to represent the people in the third Guam legislature, how would you turn that around? You got 14 other colleagues. I also went into the Guam legislature thinking I'd be able to make some major changes. Made some changes, knowing that you're going to go in there or thinking that you're going to go in there and make $1 worth of change. It's lucky if you get out and you get a nickel's worth of change that you've got 14 other colleagues you're going to have to work with. Basically, what you're saying is that people distrust these people who are currently in there. I'm very critical
Well,
of
actually, what I'm
senators.
saying is they distrust government
Government.
in general.
Well, inclusive of the legislature.
It would have to
Okay,
be.
okay. So how would you go about, again, as one individual, 14 other senators that you're going to be working with, to work on that, on working that issue, to get a collaborative feeling amongst your colleagues to be able to move legislation that you want to move forward?
Well, honestly, I cannot speak for 14 other individuals. I can do what I can do, and what I can do is be truthful and be honest and diligent in the work that I do. I don't think we have the ability to legislate truth in leadership. That's something in a person's character. That's something that I kind of, it's a value that I live by. The people are not necessarily writing to Guam Blog to talk about their distrust. They're people I meet every day, I talk to every day since I started this campaign. And I hear why they're not engaged, why they think their voice doesn't matter, why their vote doesn't count. We have thousands and thousands of young people who are so totally turned off to politics because of the crap that they see day to day in the headlines and in the news, that they just don't think it's worth their time. I believe in my heart that the problem is the lack of truth in leadership. I can't speak for 14 other senators. I do not buy into the idea that one man, one woman cannot make a difference. I think we can make a difference, and that's what I will do as a senator.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator, you've been there 7 terms now, not necessarily consecutively. You've talked about, of course, the different runs that you've had. Pieces of legislation, major legislation. I can't think maybe of one legislation that has been turned down. You've had to work collaboratively with 14 other senators to be able to convince your colleague, likewise, an administration, whoever they may be, to be able to see what you're writing, to be able to pass legislation. Do you believe there's a climate as well in there, as Romeo said, in a sense, to a distrust in government?
Well, you use the term collaboration several times in your opening remarks there, and I think that's very key to everything. I mean, I'm happy to say that 90% of the bills that I've introduced, and I believe that these are substantive bills. These are not one-pagers where you just change a word. I've been able to see that 90% of my bills have been actually enacted into law, and a lot of that is because of being able to collaborate with the agencies that are going to be affected, with stakeholders, and of course with the other senators in the legislature who represent. They have their constituencies to represent. So it's important that when we go in there, I certainly have certain ideas about how I would like to see the world. But there's also competing visions of how the world should be. And one has to be willing to compromise so that the competing interests, which are just as legitimate, are protected, and that's the only way we're going to be able to get a bill through. Now, what's important is that from the outside looking in, it appears that many of the solutions that are provided by the legislature are very inefficient, technically inefficient, but politically they are very rational, because it finds that compromise, the balance, in making sure that the competing interests are being protected.
Thank you. Senator, come back to you. Military buildup. We've had this, I think since I was in the 28th Guam legislature, the talk about when they were still in the negotiating table. You said this is what basically prompted you to come back into the legislature. Military buildup, we have seen it have gone from 8,000 to 10,000. Now it's a number 5,000, anywhere from 3, 4, 5,000. We're seeing now it's not necessarily families going to be relocated here. We've gone from Pogat as the place for the firing range, now to the Retidian. Your thoughts on the military buildup? Are you in agreement on holistically them coming in here, and do you agree with the Retidian as now the place to situate their firing range?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me just fully disclose. I'm a military retiree. I've served 6 years on active duty and 20 years in the reserves, and I retired with the rank of colonel. So obviously, I do have a natural bias. I would have a natural bias towards this military buildup to support it. But never for a minute did I ever think that we can mount a a protest and go out there and this military buildup is going to go away. Those decisions are made, back in Washington, D.C. by forces bigger than us. But given that, despite that, though, we can't just give our hands up and say, okay, well, and grab ourselves by the ankle and say, have what you want. We've got to be able to voice our opinions about why we don't want a rifle range in Pagat, and that maybe having one at Retidian may be a more acceptable compromise. Now, I don't believe that there's any perfect solution to anything. And so we've got to be willing, again, as with everything else, to find what are the compromises that can be made so that it comes out to be a win-win situation. It's not going to be a perfect solution, but we don't want, I always thought that it's bad public policy is bad when you make a decision to benefit one group and totally at the expense of another group.
Thank you. Roman, you got a minute 20?
Taking up from where the senator used the phrase compromise and win-win situation, it is my personal belief that compromise is not a win-win situation. It's two sides surrendering so that you achieve a solution that isn't very effective one way or the other. I support the military buildup in large part because there's no alternative for economic development on the table, and there has not been for the last 3 years. One of the reasons why I am advocating for a Republican majority as well as change in Congress with a Republican Congresswoman Metcalf is that there has been a failure on the part of the Democratic majority that has been in charge for quite some time to coordinate with the community the type of singularity and voice that will give us some type of leverage in D.C. when those decisions are being made. And speaking of D.C., it was this Democratic Congresswoman that cut a deal that allows Retidian to be the preferred site for the Navy, but at the expense of silencing criticisms and opposition in the community. While I support the buildup and I support the idea of bringing a better military presence here on Guam, I think it has to be done with an open dialogue without silencing people and shutting down critics.
And Garuma, come back to you. Talking about majority and whether it's a Democrat or Republican majority, I as well has served, and I've served in the minority and majority as well. And I've had where we were the majority, but a big obstacle in trying to get some of these things lifted, most especially when we look at our political status, when we say the Jones Act, which my colleagues in the legislature agreed, and it was bipartisan in regards to our official petition to the Department of Transportation to try to get an easing on part of the Jones Act, which was cabotage. However, because decisions are made in places that we don't elect people to, at least if you're not a resident here in Guam, maybe some of our residents that have, again, relocated have voted for these people. Well, we don't, but they have direct impact on what happens out here. Are you in favor, or what would you do in the 33rd Guam legislature so that people allow you to serve, to be able to get some of these restrictions that's been told upon us, again, to be able to talk to your colleagues on the Democrat and Republican side to help out? And if it happens to be a Democrat that happens to be in Congress, how would you move forward, again, to try to get the easing of the restrictions that are placed upon us through federal legislation?
Well, let's be clear about one thing, Jesse. I noticed you asked that of all the guests here on your show. As a legislative candidate, the most important and probably the only effective thing I could do is to vote Republican for the congressional race. That is a duty and a matter squarely in D.C. and belongs in the congressional office. The fact is, for the last decade, we had very little action, very little work. I've already had friends from Puerto Rico and the resident commissioner, their congressional representative's office, contact me and say that if I do get in there, they like to try to work together, because in the Puerto Rican government, they too have issues with the cabotage laws. They like to have some type of alliance built. But at the legislative level, let's be real, there's very little we can do. That's why it's important that we look for change in DC that will work with the local government to educate the people on what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and support the type of movement that our congressperson has to do.
Well, thank you, Romeo. And let me just clarify with this, and before I ask Senator to comment on this, actually in the legislative side, there's a lot that you can do, because you have to convince your colleagues that this is what you want to do via resolution.
Yeah,
and to be able,
that's where I disagree.
and
A resolution to me is not very effective.
And to be able to convince whatever the administration may be, because the Magalahi is the one that will formally request, again, the exemption. So the governor of Guam is the formal person that requests the exemption, as we did in our open skies. He had to formally request the Department of Transportation to do so, and we were granted half a loaf instead of the whole loaf. Senator, please.
Well, first of all, I guess my position on the Jones Act is that it probably, I would say, benefits us more than it's a detriment to us, and for these reasons. First of all, from an economic standpoint, most of the empty ships are going from the U.S. Over to Asia, and a lot of these ships, because of the limited resources, are trying to get back to Asia to reload again and bring commodities over to the U.S. as quickly as they can. Now, I'm not convinced that the level of service demand on Guam is going to be sufficient to warrant some of these ships to swing by Guam, to drop off, 50 containers and then move on to Asia. Whereas right now we have Matson, and basically they're really almost required to do that. Economically, I'm afraid that if then it's opened up to free competition, that a lot of those empty ships are going to pick up cargo for Guam at their convenience. The second thing is that we all complain about the high cost of shipping to Guam, and so the first thing we do is we look outside and we say the Jones Act is the culprit, and whereas instead, really, I think the solution is right in front of our nose. We need to modernize our port. We had a port down there that went for 40 years without any kind of improvements. We had gantry cranes that were breaking down. We've got waterfront berths and whatnot that we had to borrow $10 million to shore up to make sure it doesn't break off into the ocean. We've got a lot of efficiencies that need to be taken care of, and that, I think, will probably go a longer ways to reduce the cost of shipping items to Guam.
Thank you. Senator, start with you again. Hospital situation. We have a brand new hospital opening up here, I think, end of the year. We'll see what happens, whether that relieves some of the things that we're seeing now in regards to healthcare. Recently, Administrator Verga had just arrived back from the Philippines talking about a partnership with St. Luke's. We welcome that. However, as you know, you guys deal with this almost on a daily basis in regards to funding sources. It's great to be able to have the expertise come out here, to be able to get equipment and things to come out here, and to have our people cared for out here, as opposed to having to relocate to other destinations. However, if we haven't solved how we're going to pay for this, a designated source of funding, how are we going to be able to pay for these things? Because again, the non-payers are going to continue to be non-payers. People who are able to pay are the ones that are going to be burdened again with the increased cost of healthcare.
Well, one thing's for sure, we got to keep our public hospital open, because let's face it, you're going to have people who cannot afford to go to the private clinics or the new regional medical center that's opening up. So we've got to have this resource available for those who are indigent and in need of medical care. We can't just turn a blind eye to that. Now, the fact that yes, it requires a lot of subsidy to keep it operating. Again, I prefer that we look inside more. The fact is that we're probably not doing as good a job at collecting the accounts receivables, and if we can do a much better job at that, then of course we can reduce that gap. We can close that gap between what they actually need and what they are getting. So again, I'm optimistic that We need to look from within to remove a lot of the inefficiencies, but the bottom line is we've got to keep that hospital open for our people.
Thank you. Roman, your response? You got a minute 30 to make it.
You know, the hospital is on its own life support system at this point. Any ideas that are brought to the table should be scrutinized. I do not think privatization by itself is the answer. However, there are core functions at the hospital that could be, in fact, outsourced that would really make it easier, I think, to focus on healthcare and the delivery of healthcare. Partnering, we've seen legislation come through this last legislature that set it up so that there could be privatization and outsourcing activities without legislative approval, very much oversight by those people elected by the voters of Guam. I think if we look at a public-private partnership, one of the foremost aspects of that deal would have to be an open and transparent process that allowed everyone to see who is involved and to what degree, and open up competition so that we can bring in more than one or two hand-picked management sources.
Okay, thank you. Romeo, we'll start with you again now. As often said, Senator had just mentioned here the fact also is that one of the things of the hospital is we have to do a better job in collections. That being said, we have to do a better job in collection, not just for the hospital, but also in delinquent property taxes. Recently, the governor has said that due to delinquent taxes, he's probably going to look at, again, auctioning off commercial property owners rather than private delinquent property owners. What are your thoughts on that and the collection of taxes? And as the senator said, we got to do a better job in collecting.
You know, at the hospital, when it comes to collecting, my personal experience and knowledge is that there are employment, HR issues, human resource issues there. It is not a matter of just simply not collecting. There are issues with...
I'm talking about delinquent property taxes.
Okay, I'll get there, but I want to touch on that. I think if we approach hiring practices, employment practices in this government the way a private sector operation would have to, we would in fact see a better environment at the hospital. As far as property taxes are concerned, that topic tends to feed into the distrust that many in our community have simply because it's not applied fairly. I think business owners struggling to keep their employees employed, struggling to keep their businesses afloat, would look at that as picking on them. Taxes are taxes. If you are going to enforce the tax code and the tax laws, it should be done fairly and equally across the board. I do know there are several places, Athens, Dublin, who have innovative housing programs to deal with delinquent tax properties that help keep the community viable. And I think we need to look at some ideas like that. Just taking the properties, that doesn't really resolve anything.
Okay, thank you. Senator, you have a minute 20.
You know, just very recently, there was actually an information briefing that was conducted by Senator Mike St. Nicholas regarding this very issue about delinquent land taxes and auctioning off. And a large problem is we don't have rules and regulations that are yet in place, so that and this rules and regs should go through an administrative adjudication process, public hearing. All the affected stakeholders will have an opportunity to make an input, and the legislature will finally be able to, approve or disapprove that rules and regs. So that's very key, is having an approved set of rules and regulations so that we know what the rules of engagement are. Mm-hmm. You're delinquent in your tax. How much time do you have to pay up? What happens if we auction off? Does the individual, for example, have the right of first refusal? If he somehow, is able to get the money? Those things are very important before, anything else. But I agree with Romeo. We can't discriminate and say, well, we will only confiscate and auction off lands that are owned by corporations, and everybody else is pretty much scot-free.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator, political self-determination, your understanding of the three different statuses, statehood, free association, and independence at this point. For what you know for what you've educated yourself in regards to the three different statuses, if November was a plebiscite date as well, and people were to vote for you guys alongside a plebiscite, with your understanding, which status are you inclined to vote for, and why not the other two? Or is there any other status that you're interested in looking at, and maybe it's time to revisit and not have just the three, but maybe something else in place of maybe one or two, or even all three of the statuses? Senator?
I would opt for statehood, and simply because I value my U.S. citizenship, and I want certainly to retain that alliance and that relationship with the United States. To align, can we be independent? Let's face it. At some point, do we align with the U.S. Or do we align with any other country? And right now, I certainly would opt to maintain that alignment with the United States. Can Guam be self-sufficient enough to be independent and go out there and play with the big boys? I think it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be a long climb. I think the U.S. has treated Guam quite well, but that's, despite that, I don't think we should be complacent and just sit back and say everything is, as Juan Fudge would always say, peachy peachy, because it's not. And I think we need to have more voice in the U.S. Congress to be able to change some of those federal laws that really are not to our benefit.
Okay, thank you.
You know,
You have a minute 10?
One of the original ideas that I wanted to bring to the table when I decided to run was the need for building dialogue that unifies our community. One of the most effective ways to do that, I believe, is through a constitutional convention. And I think that step should come before any type of plebiscite, because it actually shows the federal government that the community can in fact come together and develop a mature political structure of its own and give us more force in a plebiscite choice. Now, when it comes to a plebiscite, I have some very deeply held personal beliefs that many of my friends, Filipino friends, off-islander friends, do not agree with. In the 500 years that the U.S. has been here, the Europeans have been here, and you have Spain, Japan, the United States. The Chamorro people, the indigenous culture, the indigenous people of the island, have not chosen what they wanted to do. And I think no matter what happens moving forward, they need to have at least something in place that allows them to express their choice before the broader community is brought in.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, that's it, man. That's going to do it for this morning. Romeo, we're going to start with you. Tell the folks again your name, what side of the ballot you are, what number you are, and what would be the first thing you would like to do should the people of Guam give you the opportunity to serve in the 33rd Guam Legislature.
Well, my name is Romeo Carlos. I'm number 8 on the Republican side of the ballot, but I'm not asking for your vote in November. I'm not asking for the chance to be your senator in November. I'm asking you today to make August 30th your day, a vote for you. If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, if you want more and better from the lawmakers who are already there, from the governor who is there now, from the guy who wants to be there next, if you are simply not happy, vote 8 Romeo, not for me, for you. In November, you still have 15 votes, and between September and November, I hope to be able to convince you that I will be the voice that you need, and I will say what you can't say. But August 30th, it's all about you. Vote a protest vote, a bullet vote, one vote and nothing more, and send a message. Vote loud.
Thank you, Romeo. Senator, please.
Well, I too am number 8 on the ballot on the Democratic side. And I ask that, I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm asking to come back again for another term. And I ask that because I think by voting for someone such as myself, I bring 14 years of experience. And as with anything, you get good at your game because you've practiced at it. You've had a lot of experience in knowing how to make things work. And so from day one, I certainly can be an effective contributor. Now, one of the things that I'm focusing on right now is our procurement reform, the reform of our procurement regulations. It seems that many of our procurements get protested, and so far I've got 2 bills that I've introduced. I'm not sure that I'll be able to have time to get it through this term, but that's one of the things that I'll be focusing on. So I ask for your vote both in August and in November for Tom Ada. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate you
Yeah.
coming in here. The best
So
of luck to
nice.
you, of course, in the primary and on to the general election. You can watch this rebroadcast tonight on Local 2 tonight at 7:30, and likewise on our KUAM YouTube channel, and tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. on KUAM TV8. You'll see highlights tonight also on KUAM Headline News with Sabrina Salas and Matanani. It's goodbye for now. Tomorrow morning, my in-studio guests will be Speaker Wampat, Democrat, and former Senator Frank Blas, Jr., Republican. That's tomorrow morning on The Buzz. We'll see you then tomorrow.